Okay, let's get started. So this is, let me share the screen. So we're still in week 9. The topic of this week's reading was human populations and the way in which human populations are the sort of the parameters, the dynamics of human population growth, how that's changed over time, and how human population growth has affected ecosystems and global functioning. So we looked at, yesterday we looked at rates of, or Tuesday rather, we looked at the rates of growth, the prophecy of Malthus and quality of life, population growth and exponential growth, limiting factors, age structure. And you were assigned to do a breakout session. There were 2 readings assigned for that. And then you had some questions to consider. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go over the exam. I don't have a lot of material to cover, but I thought I should go over the exam, in particular the essay questions. And I'm in the process of grading the essay questions, and Carrie is helping with that. And that should be completed by the end of the day today. But what I did want to do was to go over the individual questions and sort of just cover briefly what I was expecting and what I generally saw in the answers that I've graded so far. So what I'll do here is to share my screen that shows, let's see, okay. So these were the questions that were assigned. Everybody sees that screen? Everybody with me? I got 53 present.
Yes, sir. You see it.
All right, so we're going to go over these one by one. And let's see, put it here. Personable lights. Okay, so let's go over these questions, and I'll briefly go over these. And if you have questions about the questions, go ahead and bring those up while I'm talking about them. Okay, so question 1. Why would consumption overpopulation lead to what Hardin in his 1968 article called the tragedy of the commons? Okay, so you got 2 jobs here. One is to define the tragedy of the commons briefly, and then explain how consumption overpopulation fits into that. So then you have to also have a concept or clear concept of what consumption overpopulation means. So the tragedy of the commons, the example that Hardin gives is the common grazing area, which villages used to have, where there was an open grassland and people were, who rode their horse into town or came in with other livestock could graze those animals there briefly and without cost. The problem is that if people would overuse this resource for their individual gain, it would deplete the grassland such that it wasn't available to anyone. So putting your individual gain over the sustainability of a common pool resource would be the tragedy of the commons. Consumption, how does consumption overpopulation fit into that? Well, what is consumption overpopulation? Well, consumption overpopulation describes the way in which human populations and human individuals, through their choices, begin to consume things in a way that damages the common pool resources that are available for all of humanity. And examples of that might be including, excess driving very large automobiles, for example, large fuel inefficient automobiles. That would be an example of that. Somebody gave that. Generally, living a lifestyle in which, in order to support that lifestyle, it needed high levels of resource exploitation. And this was discussed in the first chapter of the book, when they talked about how you had to consider the way in which the population demands were multiplied in terms of their needs. Okay, any questions about question 1? All right, identify 2 types of human environmental impact that may be created locally, but that have global consequences. What are the global consequences of each event, and describe how the actions would be needed to address each issue. You know, discussing the actions is something that got left out of a lot of the responses that I've seen to date. But generally, you know, a good example of a good answer that I saw was somebody talking about overuse of plastics. So people use plastic bags, straws, etc. locally. That's a local and an individual decision. But that source of plastics enters into the environment, particularly the aquatic environment, and can have the accumulation of plastics can have these impacts. And of course, the mitigation of plastics would be to reduce or control their use. Other examples would be, another good example is water treatment. So people choose to have septic systems instead of sewage treatment, and this degrades the watershed, and collectively you can have larger impacts of that. Questions about 2? Okay, draw a graph to illustrate the relationship between marginal cost of pollution and the marginal cost of pollution abatement. All right, I don't know if I can show you a screen. Let's see. Okay. All right, so what am I looking for here? This needs to be over here. So I'm looking for a graph, a simple graph. And on the y-axis is cost.
All we see is a white screen, Professor.
Yeah, are you drawing?
I am
Professor?
drawing. You're not seeing it?
No.
Sorry. You see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, so on the left, the y-axis is cost. On the left, and on the x-axis is abatement. And so, as the cost of pollution should have a curve like this, and the cost of abatement should have a curve like this. So the cost goes up as you try to remove more and more of the pollution. And then what we're particularly looking for is this optimal position here. And most people got that. So I needed to have labels of the axes, the 2 curves drawn in the correct sense, and the crossing point identified as being an economic optimum for pollution cost and pollution abatement.
Professor, I was wondering whether or not the x-axis was abatement or the total amount of pollution.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, it could also be total amount of pollution. That's certainly an acceptable answer, and that's probably in the book. But yeah, it's sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't mark that off. What I was mostly looking for is that you did, in fact, label your axes, and that you understood that cost was being weighed against the, the total pollution or total abatement. Okay. All right. Stop that share. Share. Okay. So you. All right. All right, now what is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA? And here I wanted to see that you gave a date when this was enacted, so 1970 or 1972, because it was first introduced in 78 and then it was refined several times. So I wanted some kind of date. And the reason for the date was to indicate that you understood that this had been in place for a long time, and that the U.S. society had been using this kind of regulation to control and protect the environment for several generations. I also wanted you to identify some key features of the NEPA, and a lot of people got the fact that it was designed to protect the environment, but specifically I was looking for the requirement within NEPA for environmental impact assessment, EIS, for environmental impact statements for projects, whether they were development of a highway, building a dam, and so forth. And that also that these comments involved open, sharing of information with the public and the opportunity for public comment. A lot of people got this. All right. Any questions about NEPA? All right, briefly discuss the roles of autotrophs in the environment. And this should have been a slam dunk. What I was looking for is that autotrophs produce the food on which the entire ecosystem subsequently depends. So they're the base of the food chain. But I wanted you to use the terms photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. A lot of people left out chemosynthesis, and I marked off a point for this because I've emphasized chemosynthesis as an autotrophic function several times in lecture. Okay, what are krill? And here some people got tripped up because they identified krill as a keystone species. And that misunderstands the role of a keystone species. Keystone species are specifically not the species which is the biomass or numerical abundance, most abundant within an ecosystem, but they are keystone species are species which perform some critical function. Very often they're a predator that keeps other predators in check or prevents overgrazing, etc. So krill are crustaceous, small crustaceans. They feed on phytoplankton. They are themselves the foodstuff for whales, penguins, seals, and other larger components of the ecosystem. The population of these animals, so they're prey items for whales, including the baleen whales, or specifically the baleen whales, which would be blue whales, gray whales, but blue whales, not humpback whales, blue whales, sei whales, minke whales. These are whales that you would find in Antarctica that eat krill. Now, these whales have been hunted, and one would expect that with the removal of the top predator of krill, that the krill population would have exploded, but in fact, the krill population has declined, and that's because the krill are dependent on whales for recycling the nutrients. So the whales consume the krill and excrete nutrients which the krill need to maintain, which the phytoplankton need to maintain their growth. And so the population of krill has declined. The phytoplankton they eat live on sea ice. The sea ice has retreated. And so this Antarctic ecosystem is really out of balance because of overfishing. Well, the krill are overfished somewhat. They're not overfished the way some other species are, but they have been probably fished in excess of sustainable levels. So that's basically what I was looking for. Okay, list and briefly explain 3 ways in which human activities are impacting biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles, what am I looking for here? I'm looking for nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, water, carbon. So these are the big, biogeochemical cycles, and the book identifies these very clearly. So I would expect, an obvious answer would be they're impacting the carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels and taking, fossil carbon and reintroducing it into the atmosphere. They're impacting the nitrogen cycle by, with the artificial production of nitrogen fertilizers and fixed nitrogen. So they're increasing the amount of nitrogen in the ecosystem. Phosphorus cycle, they're impacting the phosphorus cycle through agriculture, through feedlot practices. Hydrocycle is being impacted by over depletion of aquifers, changing the climate change, changing rainfall patterns, etc. So, but what I really wanted you to understand was what biogeochemical cycles were, and to have the idea that these are these specific compounds that are cycling through the global ecosystem, and this cycling involves biological and geological processes. Discuss the major components of the hydrologic cycle and identify the processes and transfer of water from one reservoir to another. And here a lot of people drew a diagram. And what I wanted was you to draw a diagram, not to copy one out of a book, because drawing the diagram, labeling everything is one of the ways that we learn things. And that applies all the way down. I didn't want you just to copy. If I say draw something, I mean draw it. And I'm not going to mark off for artistic ability or lack of ability, but what I want to see is that you can have the arrows pointing in the right direction, label things correctly, and identify the relationships between things. So this should have been pretty straightforward. Keystone species, I've already briefly commented on that. So the keystone species is typically not the most abundant species in the population. It's a species that plays a critical role. And the classic example is a classic example is the sea otter. So the sea otter is certainly not the biomass or numerical dominant in the kelp ecosystem, but what they do is they have a critical impact because one of their food items are sea urchins, which would otherwise overpopulate and kill off the kelp. I also accepted wolves because we had a really nice video and a nice demonstration of how wolves acting as predators, had this far-reaching impact on the Yellowstone ecosystem. Draw a graph that shows how population increases from 0 until it reaches carrying capacity. All right, what did I want to see with that? I will stop sharing and share screen, share the whiteboard, and how do I erase all this? All right, so lost my screen. Okay, so what I'm looking at for here is again a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. So on the x-axis we have time. On the y-axis we have population size. And then we're assuming that the population starts at size 0 at time 0. So you really should be going all the way back to the origin here to draw this graph. And initially, the rate of growth is relatively slow as the number of individuals available for reproduction is small. But the feedback, positive feedback loop means that as there are more individuals and they're not limited by available nutrients or available ecosystem supply, their numbers can grow, and eventually this produces a nonlinear effect. So there's a exponential rate of growth over time. So what I want you to label is slow here, and this is fast, but I'm looking for in particular exponential rate of growth. All right, so they're growing over time, but so this is the exponential curve, but then this becomes a logistic curve when factors become limiting, when the number of individuals increases so much that they don't have enough availability of some resource that they need or resources. And this can be food, water, habitat, critical ecosystems for reproduction, etc. But eventually, the growth of the population starts to outstrip the available resources, and the growth rate decreases, and so it starts to tail off. All right, and eventually, you reach some carrying capacity, which is how many things that the population can include. Well, a lot of people drew this as a straight line, but really it sort of fluctuates over time. It goes up and down around this carrying capacity. So I didn't mark off for this too much, but you know, if people drew this, I was more impressed. So I wanted to see some kind of indication that the population had met up with limiting factors. And then this should be labeled as carrying capacity. All right, so that's what I'm looking for here. The axes labeled, the curve shown correctly. So it's exponential in this portion of the graph. So this is exponential, but this is not exponential. So this is logistic. And so this carrying capacity sigmoid shaped curve is one of the key concepts in our understanding of ecosystem function. All right, questions about that? All right. How is climate change currently affecting the Earth's ecosystems? So one thing I was looking for here, which some people got, was the concept of biomes. So one of the things that's happening with climate change is that the biomes are being shifted. Well, what's a biome? Later on, you're asked, given the opportunity to define a biome more precisely. But biomes, as we look in the text, at least terrestrial biomes, are defined by temperature and precipitation. And there are other more complex factors that define aquatic ecosystems, but temperature is certainly a component of that, water temperature. So I wanted this concept that, you know, that the broad zonation of where organisms could survive and what kind of ecosystems could develop in different regions was being distorted by these changes to the planets because of the climate change. And examples, there were lots of examples. People picked examples that were given in the book, the change of the tundra, you know, with a melting of the permafrost and, you know, expansion of coniferous forests. That was a great example. You know, loss of tropical rainforest due to you know, drought and so forth. That was another good example. But, you know, I wanted this realization that, you know, it wasn't just sort of localized effects that came out of nowhere, but these were broad global scale changes that were affecting ecosystems. And some examples. Okay, define ecological niche and the role of limiting resources in determining an organism's ecological niche. Well, this is a subtle question. A lot of people didn't bring enough understanding to it or didn't explain more fully how they understood this. So as I said in lecture, the niche is sort of a multidimensional description of what it is that an organism needs to have a sustainable population in a certain habitat or ecosystem. And this can include access to food, water, reproduction, certain kinds of habitats. So think of, you know, birds that need certain kinds of nesting areas for appropriate reproduction. Many other factors this can play in. So the combination of those factors defines a niche. And, you know, some students, you know, were really got this, and they explained how, you know, when niches overlap, there's competition, and that competition has the effect of reducing the scale of the niche of both species that are competing. Okay, so I wanted this, you know, I wanted you to demonstrate, you know, a complete understanding in this. Okay, wetlands and estuaries are highly productive and provide enough food to support a variety of ecosystems. This was a relatively long question. Maybe I should have added more points for it here. But define an ecosystem and give 3 reasons why estuaries are most fertile ecosystems in the world. Well, estuaries are, you know, the boundary between a water supply from a river or stream, and its aquatic pool, whether that's a lake or a ocean. So that's where there's an interaction between ocean water and river water, for example. And the wetlands and estuaries are highly productive because there are plentiful nutrients. The possibility for primary production, both from algae and macrophytes, is widespread. So that produces food for a variety of ecosystems. So these factors combine to make estuaries among the most fertile in the world. Two roles that coastal ecosystems play that are ecologically important: well, nutrient reduction, pollution control, their habitats for juvenile species. There are many factors that you could have done here. Two ways in which humans have had negative impact on estuaries and ecosystems, the Mississippi River ecosystem, for example, is a great example of an estuary system that's been severely impacted by dredging, damming, changes in watershed management that reduce the supply of sediments and have caused this very productive ecosystem to decline over time. Okay, major biomes are distributed as a result of two primary abiotic factors. And, I guess I should have put major terrestrial biomes here, but hopefully that was understood. And you could have done it in the ocean, but you would have had to, identify, sunlight availability and nutrients, for example. But terrestrial ecosystems are defined by the availability of rainfall and temperature. Okay, and so, and you could discuss how temperature and rainfall would define desert ecosystems, temperate forests, etc. And you can include two specific biomes and their distribution in your discussion. Making the link between moving towards northward on the planet and climbing a mountain. Well, as you move northward, the temperature generally becomes colder, and as an average, the precipitation is reduced. And that's similar to what you would experience hiking up a mountain, so that you can find on the tops of mountains, in Africa, you can find plants that you would be similar to, or identical in some cases, to plants that only occur in the Arctic. So hiking up a mountain is similar towards traveling northward within the terrestrial biomes. Okay, are there questions about any of these topics that were raised? And so far that I'm seeing pretty good grades. Only one or two of you have really fallen, shorter than I would have liked. But overall, the performance on the multiple choice and the essay grade was pretty good. Questions about the exam?
I have a question.
Sure.
Professor McDonald, are you going to release a rubric that you use to grade these questions? I know you just went over them with us right now, but I'm just, so like when we get our grade back, we can see like where exactly we didn't.
I tried to put in a rubric, but it's not letting me add a rubric. I was up late last night trying to add a rubric to this, and for some reason I haven't been able to do this. So for the questions that I marked so far, I would just put in comments to, little phrases to indicate, what it was that I was looking for that was missing. And I just write down the number of points that you receive per question in, as a comment within the text that you provided. So that's what I'm doing, and I thought that this discussion in class today would make it clear what I was looking for.
Were some questions weighted differently than others, or were they all weighted the same?
They were all weighted the same.
Okay.
Right, they were all weighted the same, and the graduate students had to answer all 15 questions, and then we just prorate the grade in terms of what they got, compared to what they could have gotten. Okay. So let's go to the modules. And today what we're supposed to be doing is reading two articles predicting the impacts of COVID-19 on US birth rates and global poverty. So there are links to these, either the article itself or the website. This website on global poverty is pretty interesting because they track a whole bunch of different factors that develop this. And then I wanted you to consider a number of particular questions. Why do authors think that COVID-19 impacts on US fertility will be different from that of snowstorms or power failures that cause people to be together with their romantic partners? All right, so it's kind of a truism that if there's a power failure or a hurricane and people are together, in the house, that romantic activity will ensue, and that will produce higher birth rate downstream. So that's the sort of general idea. In fact, apparently that it's difficult to demonstrate that that actually occurs, but it's certainly a popular idea. But COVID-19 apparently is different from this, and why is that? And then look at the so how is that different? What is the predicted impact of COVID-19 on global poverty? Speculate about how a reduced birth rate might affect US society over the next 10 years or 20 years. So, to make some connections and synthesize between the anticipated impact of US of COVID on birth rates and what's that going to produce for us? How could that impact us downstream? And look at the theory of democratic transitions to predicted changes in global poverty. So we understand what a demographic transition is. I discussed that in class on Tuesday, but I want you to take that theory and apply it to this concept of global pandemics. And then I'm going to put you into your breakout rooms now, and you'll have about 15 minutes or 20, well, let's say 15 minutes to come up with answers for each of these 4 questions. We'll get back together and I'll choose individual teams, and I'd like the teams to make a presentation of their ideas and then lead a discussion, general discussion in the class on each of these topics. And I'm interested and I think we should be interested in our individual experiences. How is COVID-19 and this pandemic sort of affecting our well-being, our sense of what's going to happen in the future, job prospects and so forth. So that's that's of interest, and I think we should be discussing that. So okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I will open the breakout rooms. And so that's what you have to do, and I'll be closing the breakout room session, let's say at 1:20. Let's say 1:20. I'd like to have plenty of time for a lengthy discussion here. Okay, any questions before you go into your breakout rooms? Nope, everybody's ready? Okay, opening all rooms. And I noticed that we're missing about 20 people from the class. So if you're in a breakout session and there, it's only you and one other person or something like that, let me know, because this is an example of you're not being supported by the other members of your team if they leave you alone to do this, and I want to know that because this is starting to be an issue. Not a big issue, but there have been some problems with individual teams where some of the members are having to do all of the work. And when those things occur, we'll take action to make sure that there's appropriate consequences. Okay, any questions? All right, I'm going to open the breakout rooms. And Carolina, you go into.
I'm in the Planeteers.
Planeteers.
Thank you.
Carrie, oh, wait a minute, Carrie, I got to do the thing with undoing you as a participant. All right, Carrie, I'm going to put you into only clams. Darren, you're in Aquatic Junkies.
Correct.
James Broom, where are you?
Can't fathom.
Can't fathom. Kate Ritz,
Team title.
team title.
I'm in team title too.
Okay, Penelope,
Aquatic Junkies.
and Whitney. Where would you like to go, Whitney?
Green Machine.
Green Machine. Okay. Penelope, are you not able to join?
No, I didn't get like the pop-up.
Okay, you might have to quit and then rejoin the meeting. Let's see.
Okay.
And who else? So Mackenzie, are you not able to join? Marissa, are you able to join meetings? Where did you need to be, Penelope?
Aquatic Junkies.
Aquatic Junkies. Okay, can you get in now? Yeah. Gwen Oval, are you able to join? Marissa Gleason, are you able to join? Marissa? You're muted, Marissa. Gwen? Gabriella? Yeah, okay. Hello, Beaches. Are you ready for your discussion?
We're getting there. We're filling out our questions now.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully we'll call on you.
Somehow, I don't know.
Hi.
Hello, how's it going?
Good.
Thank you.
You ready for your presentation?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, any questions?
Not really.
So I do want you to sort of try to, if you're called on, to try to lead a discussion, so to try to bring people in, make comments that, allow other sort of, opinions and things, because I'd like to see that we can try to get our discussion a little bit more engaged and a little bit more far-reaching.
Well, I do have a question.
Yeah.
For the question 4, that's demographic transitions.
Uh-huh.
So we are right now in stage 2, right? Like the stage 2 will be the one that it's getting affected.
Right.
So stage 3 and 4 would consequently be also affected.
Well, you know, what's the first demographic transition? The first demographic transition occurs in developing countries when medical advances lower the death rate, right? And so births are a lag behind that. So as the death rate goes down, you would expect initially the population to increase. All right. So what's happening with COVID? Is the death rate going down or up? And, you know, particularly it's going up more sharply in the developing world. In our country, it's going up more sharply in, you know, communities that are affected by poverty. So, you know, think about that and, you know, where you would expect that to occur. And then, you know, also the question of how this is going to affect birth rates, you know, generally. So, you know, and I don't know that there's an exact right answer, but, you know, take that kind of thinking and those kind of principles and apply them to the question. All right?
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. See you later.
Bye.
See ya.
Hello, junkies. You guys ready?
We are. We have all of our questions answered.
Okay.
We were discussing the demographic transition model a little bit, making sure that we understand the question and how it, you know, relates to that. But other than that, I think we're pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the most challenging of the questions, because it sort of asks you to take this theory and apply it to, you know, predict how it's going to affect things. So, you know, what is the first demographic transition? How does that work?
Well, they talk about how there's 5 different stages, and a lot of information that I've seen suggests that obviously no one's in the first stage, because that was like pre-industrial revolution.
No, that's happening. And I mean, you know, declining death rates are the first stage. You know, the first demographic transition occurs when medical advances and sanitation reduce the death rate. Okay, so when the death rate goes down, but the birth rate stays constant, you would expect the population to do what?
The population size should remain fairly constant, shouldn't it?
Well, that's not what happens in, you know, developing countries according to the age pyramid, right? So as the death rate declines, if the birth rate is usually a lagging indicator, so that the birth rates don't decline until some time after the death rate declines. And so the you know, growth of populations, particularly younger members of the population, younger demographic groups within the population, that is a result of a declining death rate, but a constant birth rate. Okay, so the population would increase. Well, what happens with COVID in the developing world or in, you know, less economically disadvantaged communities in the United States? You know, how would you expect, you know, COVID to respond there? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, you know, you got to like take these concepts and apply them to this new situation. You know, we haven't really faced a global pandemic the way we are now. I mean, generally. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. So I see 5 participants, but only 1 participant with a camera. So everybody else is there?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that's come up when I've been in the other breakout rooms is how you apply the theory of demographic transition. And is that something that you all have gotten clear in your mind?
Yes, that was the question that I answered. And I basically just applied the data in the articles and kind of tried to understand how it's going to change the population. So, and kind of pinpoint those changes that the demographic transitions talk about. So for example, I've used the data that Kearney and Levin put out in their article about the Spanish flu having a decline in annual birth rates. And I also use the data of the other article talking about an increase in poverty. And I pretty much related the two and said, you know, because of these two reasons, we are expected to see a decline in birth rates that will not only be delayed, but also just like won't happen at all because we won't get back to normal anytime soon, pretty much.
Okay, well, it's not just the decline in birth rate, it's another factor. What's the other factor?
I'm not sure.
Well, the first demographic transition typically results in an increase in population, right? So why
Okay.
does the population increase during the first demographic?
Because there is an increase in, well, in certain countries, there might be an increase in poverty.
No. Population increases. So this is a good question. So the population increases initially in the demographic transition because medical advances and, you know, sort of general societal structure reduces the death rate. So if the birth rate is constant, you reduce the death rate, particularly in the younger demographics, what happens to the population?
It increases.
It increases. Okay, well, here's COVID. So what's COVID doing?
It's reducing the population.
Well, it's increasing the death rate again.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's probably reducing the birth rate for reasons that are discussed. So I'm not going to give you an answer, but that's how I want you to think about that.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
All right, we've got a few more minutes and then we'll be back together. Hello, Tickalix.
Hello.
You have any questions? You understand all of the answers there?
We have one question about question 4.
Okay, this is I've had a lot of questions about this. So,
Okay.
you know, here you're having to, you know, this is challenging. I know this is a challenging question because you got to sort of take these concepts and put them together. So I'll ask you generally, and this will help you if you end up getting called on, you know, what is the first demographic transition? What's the result for the population and what causes it?
All right, so that's high birth rate and high death rate, correct? Is the first transition?
What is the first demographic transition?
Like stage 1?
Yeah, but what happens?
High birth rate and high death rate.
No, I mean, you know, what's the result? What happens in the first demographic transition to a population size? I guess I didn't explain this well enough Tuesday. Maybe I'll share a graph here before we go into that.
Grows.
The population increases. Okay, does the population increase because the birth rate increases?
And the first one looks like both.
Well, the understanding of the demographic transition is that the population increases because the population is sort of used to, you know, culturally a certain level of birth rate, right? Large families, etc. And, you know, people have large families when there's high infant mortality, for example, because they have to have lots of babies in order for, you know, some of them to survive to adulthood, right? But then what happens when in a society that's experiencing the first demographic transition is that the death rate decreases because there's better access to medical care, more widespread access to food, particularly infant, you know, and children, health care, so that their survival and their death rate goes down, their survival increases. So the first demographic transition typically produces an increase in population. Okay, well, now apply that to COVID. What's happening within COVID? Okay, what's the second demographic transition? Well, the second demographic transition applies to things like, diseases of society, heart disease, cancer, and so forth. Well, what's happening as a result of COVID right now? Medically, are people treating those conditions? No, because the hospitals are overwhelmed. So lots of the things, so that's one source of mortality, even in a developed society, is that people aren't able to get, medical care because, the hospitals are overwhelmed. People are afraid to go to the hospital. People are afraid to go to the doctor. And so the mortality from heart disease, for example, that's a big one. It's not being controlled because people aren't taking care of it because of the whole COVID problem. So you can see that it would affect them. That's what I'm asking you to do. Think about that. All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to close the rooms now, and we'll all get back together. And if I ask you the question, you'll be all ready, right?
Yes, sir. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we should all be back together now. Welcome back. So let's, I have a list of people that I've already called on, but I'm going to just, because I'm asking for a little bit more here. So I'm going to spin my wheel. You can't see it, but I hope you'll trust that, in fact, I'm choosing at random from amongst the teams. And so the wheel is spinning. And the arrow points to homeboys. All right, so homeboys, why do you think, go ahead and activate your cameras and unmute yourselves and tell us why the authors think for this COVID-19 that the impacts on US fertility will be different from snowstorms or power failures, etc. And so go ahead. Go ahead and unmute yourselves so that you can all speak. And if you want to share this, you share your screen or something like that, you should be able to do that if you wanted to bring up any of the graphics or anything that's in there. All right, go ahead.
Yes, so that was my question in my group. And basically what the authors talked about was people assume that after there's a snowstorm or a power outage, that the birth rate goes up after romantic couples are forced to stay indoors together for a while. And so they assumed once the pandemic started and the quarantine began that the same thing was going to happen, but over a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But they decided that that was not the fact.
Uh-huh.
Basically due to a lot of people were losing their jobs, and so financial reasons and other various things caused people to choose not to plan a family during a pandemic.
Okay, well, anybody else on your team want to add to that? All right, well, for general discussion, without getting into, the logistics of romantic relationships, how do we think that this is affecting things? I mean, in your personal experience, are you more likely to go on dates, or, is this changing things? If you think differently about the future, do you feel this at a personal level? Or do you see this changing things, in your own lives? I'm interested generally.
I can answer that, I guess.
Sure.
Well, I've been in a relationship for almost 3 years, and personally, it's actually like made me closer to my girlfriend. But I think that for a lot of people, it will definitely make them not want to have children if they're in a committed relationship. And I think it's a very hard time to date if you're not in a relationship because of the uncertainty of COVID and you don't want to expose yourself to people and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, I think it's going to be a really big impact on birth rates in the long-term future, because it's not only because of COVID. Once, even if there's a vaccine for COVID, I think that the economic factors will still affect birth rates for years.
Right, and a snowstorm or a power outage, you know, how are they different from COVID?
It's like just a short-term thing that can be fixed.
Right, so it's just sort of a break in the routine that, you know, might result in romantic activities.
Yeah, I would also say that a snowstorm or like a power outage doesn't affect hospitals and the medical system, whereas a pandemic does. So for example, if you're considering having a child now, you might run with the risk of not being able to have family in the hospital when you deliver it, or you know, also having the uncertainty that you are putting yourself in the hot spot of where the virus is, you know, by going to the hospital. So I think that there's more factors to consider rather than with a snowstorm, for example.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question, but you know, I think the other factor in here is sort of economic well-being, you know, because the other impact of COVID, you know, which is really, you know, being disproportionately affecting a lot of different communities, but it's, you know, disproportionately affecting the economic well-being of people, younger people, who are the people who under normal circumstances would be the ones most likely to be having a family, right? But if you don't have a job, or you've lost your job, or you've lost your health care, that makes you know, even a committed, happy relationship, it's like, wait a minute, this isn't a good time because I don't have a job, or you know, there's no schools. You know, so there's a lot of uncertainty that results from that impacts, you know, not just, you know, how people are getting along as individual couples, but also how they are getting along as people who have to make a living and, you know, pay the rent and buy food. Right? All right. Well, thank you, homeboys. So I will make a note that you all answer the questions. And let me choose another team for question 2. What is the predicted impact of COVID-19 on global poverty? And okay, big lean green machine. Go ahead, big lean green machiners, please unmute your camera and your microphone and pick somebody to discuss the predicted impact of COVID-19 on global poverty. And I'm looking for specific numbers here. They give you, you know, specific predictions in that article. What are they, and how, you know, what are the principles that apply?
Well, overall, like globally, the impact of COVID is going to increase the number of individuals living in extreme poverty. The specific numbers in the article are between 88 and 115 million more people will live in extreme poverty from the levels prior to the pandemic. This will also set back the world rate of poverty reduction by around 3 years. And it's mostly because many people obviously have stay-at-home orders. They can't work. They have limited savings to rely on, and most of those savings have already been depleted, like due to the length of the pandemic and its effects. So there's a difficulty in trying to just have enough funds to sustain themselves, and that pushes people into living in poverty. And specifically South Asia and I believe sub-Saharan Africa, and then East Asia and Pacific areas will be most affected in that order.
Okay. So societies in which there's sort of a, you know, people are kind of marginal, but their poverty was being reduced by better access to markets and more availability of goods, better agriculture, etc. But then with COVID, that changes.
Yeah, a lot of like the people that live day to day lives, like from paycheck to paycheck, even those are the most affected.
Okay. Anybody want to comment, or can you relate, sort of extreme poverty globally to poverty in the United States?
The article, it didn't really go much into it. It sort of focused more on extreme poverty in like the areas that he just mentioned, and they used a baseline of very low earnings per day. I think it was $1.90 to $5.50 per day of earnings.
Mhm.
I don't know that there's people in, I mean, I'm sure there are, but in the United States that are making that little amount of money. It didn't really go into much detail about us, but that would be interesting to see a comparison. They kind of jumped around, and they had a couple, you could click on a couple of areas where it went back, and in April, it was estimated between 40 and 60 million people would be affected. And then when they redid it in here in October, that's when it jumped up to 88 to 115. And they were using like a two-part method, a baseline and a downside. Assuming that the virus remains at levels expected, that the economy would recover by the end of the year. And then it also looked at a downside that assumes that the outbreak lasts longer, and that shutdowns that are in effect will remain in effect, and in areas that it has been opened up, it'll be reintroduced. So I think all of that are factors in this. So we could see poverty reduced even more moving forward.
Poverty reduced or poverty increased?
Increase.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? And all right, so we're talking about global poverty, and global poverty is presented as this, extreme poverty where people, essentially earn enough during a day, one day, to support themselves for that day and their family for that day. So there's this, lagless impact. If you're unable to work or have income that day, you may not be able to eat that day. And when I was a lot younger, I worked as a volunteer in Haiti, and in Haiti they had this expression, "travail pour manger." Anybody know what that means? Work to eat. And that meant that you had to work every day in order to be able to eat every day. And and it was kind of interesting because the local priests, Catholic priests, would come and they would preach against people working 7 days a week, because according to religious doctrine, you should take Sunday and rest. That should be a day of prayer and rest and everything. And people who were very poor had to work every day. And this was a violation of, religious practices. But people were in the position where they had to do that. They had to live that way. And so that was an eye opener for me in those days, that, people could be so close to the margin that they wouldn't, So we have a different expression in US society, and I'd like some reaction here. In US society, we kind of express that need of, sort of constant income. What do we call that? Somebody.
Like living paycheck to paycheck?
I heard it. I started to hear it. What was it? Living paycheck to paycheck, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how like. All right. So I'm sorry. Really quick. When I was getting out of the Army, you have to go through. They put everyone through. Just weeks of you do different classes. So basically, so that they can kind of ensure you don't fail at life as soon as you leave. So you do classes.
Good of them.
You do a lot of stuff like that. And so going through the financial class, she's like teaching us about credit and talking all this stuff about credit cards and things like that and whatnot. And then you fill out this like debt sheet. And I was asking her, I was like, well, what am I supposed to put for all these things? She's like, well, just put your bills. I was like, okay, like my phone and insurance and stuff. She's like, well, no, your debt. I was like, ma'am, I don't understand what you're telling me. Are these not what you're talking about? And I ended up being the only person in the class who didn't have all this debt. Like everybody. And then I found out that it's not even just in the Army. Like there's so much debt everywhere. And people, and then also a lot of people that live paycheck to paycheck. I mean, some of them can't help it. That's just the amount they're paid.
Right. So you're identifying an important factor in American society, which is that, so it's an important factor in American society, which is that people, have a tendency to fall farther and farther behind. Now, part of that is, the expectations that they have. So, you want to be able to, not just eat, but go out to restaurants every once in a while. And if you can't afford it, well, you put it on the credit card. But, that over time, if your finances are organized that way, that means that your debt is increasing. And so the paycheck to paycheck, a lot of what you need to do with your paycheck is to service your debt. And so, one of the crises that's occurring is that people, their level of indebtedness is going through the roof. And that would be something to look at. What is the level of credit card debt? And how is that increased during the COVID pandemic? And that's a real interesting point. All right, we want to keep going here and speculate about how the reduced birth rate might affect US society over the next 10 years or 20 years. So this should be a pretty quick answer. And the team I'm looking to do this is the Planeteers. So Planeteers, please unmute and let us know what you think. Mr. Hanson, what do you say?
Okay, this wasn't my question, but I'll try to do it. Okay, so I think in the next 10 years, we'll see more of an economic impact in terms of, I think we'll see lasting impacts on the economy from the shutdown. But then when you get into 20 years, you have falling birth rates, especially in 2021. So when that generation will become the working age, you'll see a decrease in numbers. And then because of that decreased population in the workforce, you'll see impacts on tax-funded programs like Social Security and Medicare. And I'm sure there's tons of other impacts that would be affected by that decrease in population.
Okay, so Jack has identified, changes in revenue to Social Security, for example, as an impact that may happen down the road because of reduced population size in this particular demographic. So, people most affected, young people, may defer having children because of COVID. And, generally birth rates would go down, and that would, are there other impacts that other people might want to identify? So thanks, Jack, but anybody else have a comment on that?
We have one that was a little obscure, but we found an article from 1975 that said a decrease in birth rate affects the consumption of milk in the United States. So not only milk, but diaper products, preschool care, all those things that people with kids need, either prices will increase or they might become obsolete.
Okay, so that there's a, I think, I don't know about the price of milk, but, that's certainly a question in there. But all of the demands of children, disposable diapers and formula and car seats and everything else, that could be a reduced demand for that. With reduced demand, there's economic impacts for the industries or the agricultural activities that would produce, for those demands. So falling birth rates can have a very broad economic impact. And in fact, school systems, what about the school systems? What's going to happen to the school systems if there are fewer children coming in needing to go to school? Well, that is happening in some areas, some parts of the country where there's really, low levels of childbirth, like Maine, for example, is an example of a state where there are very low birth rates. The average age tends to be pretty high. And as a result, schools end up closing because there are not enough kids to support, the schools. So They're broad spreading. All right, well, let's go on in the time we have left to question 4. And this was kind of a challenging question because you're having to sort of bring a bunch of different ideas together and talk about that. So let's see what we got here. All right, looks to me like can't fathom is on deck. So can't fathom. Can you please unmute and answer the question 4?
Yes, that was my question.
So go ahead and unmute so we can see who's talking.
James.
Okay.
1 second. Basically, demographic transitions is how populations change over time, right?
Right.
And what we've discussed is poverty. So poverty is expected to grow, and I guess the demographic transition would be as poverty grows, you have less birth rates, and that's supposed to continue for a while because of the nature of the pandemic and how long it's lasting. Like you said, it's a hard question. I'm not sure I fully understand demographic transitions.
Okay, yeah, well, that comes out. Anybody want to help out here with some things? I went and met in several groups and you know, so did you have any other ideas about that?
So, oh, sorry.
Okay, I was gonna say that the demographic transition normally for developed countries is to have a high birth rate. But what the pandemic will likely do is have an increased birth rate and a decreased, an increased death rate and a decreased birth rate, which is really the opposite of what should be happening for the LDCs to transition to become more developed. So in my opinion, I think it would delay the development of the less developed countries.
Okay, well, let's be clear about, and you know, when the groups that I visited, there was some misunderstanding about the first demographic transition, and maybe I didn't do a good job of explaining that in class on Tuesday. But the first demographic transition, the result of the first demographic transition, and we saw this when we looked at the age, you know, the population pyramids for a developing country. I think Kenya was the one that was used. The first demographic transition occurs, you know, birth rates have reached a sort of a stable state because people have to, with this high childhood mortality, you have to have a lot of children in order to have some of them survive into adulthood. Well, the population growth in developing countries occurs not because the birth rate increases, but because the death rate, particularly among, you know, childhood mortality, decreases. And that's a result of better access to medical care, better access to food, other social, you know, schooling, other social factors that, you know, allow more children to survive, essentially. And so that produces this big increase there. Okay, well, and then, you know, over time, the birth rate declines as society becomes more stable, more developed. And, you know, okay, what's the second demographic transition? The second demographic transition occurs when there's a decrease in the death rate due to you know, developed country diseases, heart disease, cancer, things like that, that require different care. Well, how is COVID impacting both of those transitions? That's kind of what I wanted you to think about here. And has anybody got some answers to that in the little bit of time we have left?
So for what I put in mind, in my question is that it's a little bit hard to identify which stage a developed country like the US would be in right now, because there's not really a stage that factors in an increased death rate with a decreased birth rate. Because of what you explained, normally when there's an increased death rate, there's also an increased birth rate because you have more children, because you know that not all of them will survive. So right now, America was found at the stage 4, right, which characterized both a low death rate and a low birth rate because we stabilized population growth. We weren't growing anymore. So now it's a little bit complicated, and it will probably decrease the population since we have both an increase in death rate and a decrease in birth rate.
Okay.
Putting us in a weird stage that's not necessarily defined within the demographic transitions.
Yeah, right. Well, there was an interesting statistic. I don't know if anybody noticed it, but they were saying that during the last year, so we think that there's roughly 220,000 people who died because of confirmed COVID. But the excess deaths in the United States for this period compared to the average for periods in previous years indicates about 300,000 deaths. And the authors of this study said, well, what's really going on here? Well, some people are actually dying from COVID, but that other people are dying because they don't get access for care for conditions that cause sickness or death, like heart disease, respiratory diseases, other diabetes, other factors like that, that normally they would get treated, but the hospitals are overwhelmed, people are afraid to go to the doctor, and so they don't get treated. And as a consequence, the death rate goes up. So, I think what we could say is that in all cases, this is me talking, and other people may have other ideas. If you think of the demographic transition as producing over time a reduction in population growth, I think that we're going to sort of stall where we are. The death rate's going to go up, but the birth rate is going to probably go down. So that will sort of keep things stable. And that may apply in developing countries as well as in a developed country like the United States. Anybody want to react to that?
So I don't think it's a super studied area, but alongside those issues where you have the people not being able to be treated for other diseases, there's a whole other area of mental illness where you have everyone stuck inside, and unfortunately the suicide rates probably increase. I haven't seen direct data about this, but
yeah,
I'm sure that you'll have lasting mental illness and psychological impacts as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I mean, and if that was actually pointed to in this study that I read, and I didn't follow it up I just saw it in the newspaper, so I didn't go back and look at the original study to have a deep understanding of it. But what they discussed in the article pointed to exactly that, Jack, is that, death rates or morbidity rates because of mental health issues like suicide, substance abuse, etc., they would be expected to increase. And the overall effect spread across society is an increased death rate. And then you put that together with a decreased birth rate, and the population stays stable or maybe even goes down a little bit. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the overall population decreases, but that we're not any better off with this decrease because of the economic impact. I don't know. I mean, these are things where it's not possible to come up with a definitive answer, or we have to really think about it and talk through and consider many different variables and factors to really kind of begin to understand or predict what might happen. Okay, well, we're out of time. Anybody want to, it's open. I leave the microphone open and the Zoom meeting up until 2 o'clock. If anybody wants to chime in with other comments or thoughts about this challenging topics that we're facing here.
I wanted to add something to question 2
Uh-huh.
when we went over it. I mean, so a similar or a dissimilarity between the effects of COVID in the United States versus, say, like developing or undeveloped countries is like we were given the opportunity by our government to get a stimulus check, and which assisted a lot of people who did need financial assistance during that time.
Right.
And I doubt that that was even an opportunity for people in developing countries. And so they were kind of facing all of these effects without any financial assistance, at least. So they were doing this, living on that $1, $2 a day, and had no help from their government because it's not an option.
Right.
And also, I mean, a lot of like NGOs and stuff in the United States who are working toward reducing global poverty are, I mean, it said in the article that they lost about 3 years. And I mean, they're having economic losses too. They're laying off employees. They're trying to get their feet in the right position so that they can keep helping these people. But it's definitely, I mean, not definitely, it's probably delayed a lot of their progress in this field because they need to deal with, you know, keeping their organization afloat and making sure their finances are in place so that they can help these countries.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. So that, you know, the impact has got sort of an immediate and an acute effect. And then there's a long sort of tail of continuing issues. And the economic, you know, so economics, you know, we have this particular cause of economic recession or depression, whatever the proper definition is. But, you know, we had, you know, in 2008, of course, we had the big financial crash, which you are all pretty young when that occurred. Most of you were pretty young when that occurred. One of the articles that I was reading, I forget which one it was talking about the experience of millennials. So millennials were people who were coming of age, entering the workforce during the economic recession. And apparently those folks, that demographic, you know, has experienced, you know, not just an immediate loss in employment, you know, expected salary and so forth, but that sort of like sticks with you over time, right? So the economic impact on the millennial generation, you know, has sort of had residual reduction in their overall success and their overall well-being. Well, that's going to occur for, you know, people in, you know, who are now in their 20s, you know, expecting to enter into the workforce. You're going into a workforce in an economy which is in, you know, really in decline, severe decline. And so your economic prospects are going to be impacted. And that impact is not just now, but, you know, 5 years, 10 years down the road, which could have an impact overall on birth rates, couldn't it? I mean, you know, if people are less able to have, you know, to buy a house, you know, to have, you know, the kind of economic foundation that you want when you build a family. So, you know, you could see that sort of echoing through for people in the millennial generation. So they got hit, you know, first in their 20s, and now 10, 12 years later, whatever it is, they're going through a second economic. So they really, you know, that generation are the ones who are really, you know, suffering or, you know, I don't know, suffering. That's not extreme poverty, although there is certainly poverty, you know, as a result of that. But you could also sort of see that impacting childbearing and population growth. So it's really interesting. I thought this, you know, is a really interesting example of how these different factors can, you know, have short-term effects, intermediate effects, and long-term effects. And these effects are sort of reflected or expressed in a wide range of, you know, of different societal impacts, you know, and comes down to like, how many people are there? You know, what is their, you know, economic status? And, you know, of course, we haven't had time to go into it, but, you know, there are different communities in our society that have different resources and, you know, are traditionally economically disfavored by society. And so we would expect, you know, millennial people of color, for example, would really suffer down the road, disproportionate to, you know, other groups. So it's kind of amazing how this thing is impacting us. And I think we're, you know, we're still in the acute phase here, and we haven't yet begun to kind of factor in, you know, what might happen downstream. I was reading an article today about, you know, President Biden, you know, if he gets elected, you know, you have this guy who's, you know, been pretty conservative all his life, and, you know, he's moderate and a Democrat, etc. But, you know, he's still been kind of middle of the road, and, you know, he's certainly no, you know, radical, but he's going to be facing challenges which call for, you know, radical solutions. And so it's going to set up a really interesting time, you know, potentially, if he's willing to buck the trends, you know, he could move us towards, you know, effective response to climate change. He's talking about that. And so it would be really remarkable if, you know, assuming that he gets elected, if, you know, this kind of moderate person would end up producing a real sort of more radical set of solutions. And of course, that's what his opponents are saying. They're saying, oh, if Biden gets elected, we're going to have socialism and free love, or what, I don't know what, whatever the horrible impacts that they're saying. But whether you're conservative or liberal, it's sort of like everybody kind of has a common sense that we're facing challenges which are going to require real change. Whether that change occurs passively because we don't do enough and we're hit by wildfires and flooding, or actively because we decide that we have to convert from fossil fuels, and all of a sudden you can't drive your GTO, whatever it is. So it's kind of an interesting thing. All right, well, we're coming up on 2 o'clock. Does anybody else have any comments to make here, or
I have a question about the exam.
yeah, sure.
So I was wondering, on specific questions like the autotroph question, I did not say anything about chemosynthesis, but I also did not think that my answer was wrong. So I was just wondering for like the final, how we're supposed to study to know what you're looking for in the answers if they're not specifically in the question, if that makes sense.
Well, the autotroph, the idea of an autotroph was that I wanted you, and I mentioned that chemosynthesis was important. So I was hoping that people would do that. Almost nobody got it, 1 or 2. So, and I only took off 1 point, or depending on how you expressed it, a half a point for chemosynthesis. If you gave me a lot of detail, but left out chemosynthesis, well, then I only took off a half point. If it was a pretty brief answer and you also didn't talk about chemosynthesis, I might take off a whole point. But I'm not marking you completely wrong or giving you 0 credit or anything like that. So in terms of how to study, I think, try to give as much information as you can, show what you know. And that's always the best advice that, on these things. Show the professor, show the examiner what it is that you know. Don't hold back. More is better, as long as it's correct.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sure. All right, everybody. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye now.